She was born to kill with a touch he was trained to never trust. But aboard a sabotaged prison ship bound for destruction, one human and one alien must defy orders, instincts, and interstellar conspiracies to survive and to touch. Her species kills with a touch, but the human held her hand anyway. The subject in containment unit Block D7 was going to die on this ship not by execution. The Galactic Concordat had abolished that barbarity centuries ago, but everyone knew the Vanguard Zenith wasn't meant to deliver Zalari prisoners alive. No one survived 3 stellar arcs of interstellar carrier ship when the Wardens were terrified to come within 2 meters of you. Kale Stroud checked the biomonitor on his wrist as he approached the isolation containment unit. His heart rate had spiked an involuntary response to what waited inside 6 orbital crests as a carrier ship warden, and still his body betrayed him. "You're relieving early," said Rendell, leaning against the wall beside the containment unit door. His relaxed posture belied the sweat beating on his forehead. "Couldn't stay away from our celebrity killer, huh?" "Captain's orders," Kyle replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Medical evaluation." Rendell whistled. "Rather you than me." "Remember the drill environmental suit, no direct contact, full decontamination after, don't let her speak to you directly. They say Zalari can hypnotize with their voices." Kale had heard all the rumors, most contradictory and none verified. "I've read the protocols." "Yeah, well, reading and doing are different things." Rendell pushed himself off the wall. "The death touch is no joke. Garvik from Night Shift says his cousin melted from the inside out just from brushing against one. Garvik also claims he had drinks with the Emperor of Centauri." Kale punched in his authorization code. "I'll take my chances with the protocols." The door hissed open and Rendell departed with a nervous chuckle. Kyle stepped into the Anna chamber, allowing the first door to seal before the disinfection cycle began. A fine mist filled the small space coating his uniform with nano-sanitizers. He caught his reflection in the polished metal of the inner door. At 35, with close-cropped dark hair graying at the temples and lines deepening around his eyes, he looked every bit the veteran warden, someone who had seen too much to be easily surprised. The scars on his neck from the Orion Sector rebellion were usually hidden by his collar, but today they itched against the stiff fabric. The inner door opened, and Kyle faced the most dangerous subject on the Vanguard Zenith. She sat cross-legged on the floor, her back perfectly straight. The containment unit was Spartan, a sleep platform sanitation unit and little else. A force field 2 meters in diameter surrounded her, an additional precaution against her lethal biology. The Zalari looked almost human until you noticed the subtle differences. Her skin was pale blue with a faint luminescence, like moonlight through ice. Dark purple markings swirled across her exposed arms, shifting slightly as if alive. Her hair, if you could call it that, consisted of delicate tendrils that moved with an unseen current, the color of deep space with pinpoints of light that might have been stars. "Officer Mercer," she said, her voice melodic and perfectly accented a change in the routine. "How refreshing." Kale stiffened. "How do you know my name?" Her eyes opened, revealing irises of silver with no visible pupils. "The same way I know you're left-handed, grew up in a mining colony and prefer the night shift because you don't sleep well." I observed the containment unit had surveillance, but not at angles that would reveal such details. Kale's hand instinctively moved toward his shock rod. "I've been told to prepare you for medical evaluation," he said, ignoring her uncanny observations. "Dr. Sada wishes to study me again." She uncrossed her legs and stood in one fluid motion. His curiosity is admirable if methodologically flawed. From the adjacent cells, voices called out a cacophony of languages and threats. "The death touch gets special treatment again. Just space her already. Touch the warden. Zalari, show him what happens." She didn't flinch at the taunts, maintaining a dignity that seemed at odds with her subject status. Kyle keyed his calm. "Request silence in Block D or privileges will be revoked." The voices subsided to mutters. Kyle turned his attention back to the Zalari woman. "The force field will drop and a pathway shield will establish. You will walk within the designated passageway to medical." He recited the procedure with practiced detachment. Any deviation will result in immediate sedation. Of course, she inclined her head slightly. I have followed your protocols for 47 cycles. I see no reason to change that now. The way she emphasized your made it clear she found the precautions excessive, perhaps even insulting. Kale initiated the transfer sequence. The force field around her dissipated with a soft buzz, instantly replaced by a passageway of energy that extended from her containment unit to the hallway. The pathway would keep her contained while allowing movement. As she stepped forward, the lights caught the iridescent patterns on her skin, creating an effect like oil on water. Her detention vessel jumpsuit, specially designed to accommodate her biology, hung loosely on her frame. She had lost weight since her intake. Neuro-sweeps Officer Mercer, she said as she passed him close enough that he could feel the temperature drop near her body. You're the first warden who hasn't flinched when I move. Kyle maintained his position. I've transported Shrike warriors and void walkers. A Zalari doesn't make the top 5 of my concerns. A subtle change rippled through her facial tendrils. Amusement. Perhaps. Then you are either very brave or terribly misinformed about my species. They walked in silence through the corridors of the Vanguard Zenith. The massive detention vessel carrier ship was currently housing 300 of the galaxy's most dangerous criminals during its journey to the penal colony on Oblivion Reach. Most prisoners were kept in stasis for the journey, but certain species like the Zalari couldn't survive the process. As they approached the biostation, Kale's comm unit chimed Mercer. Commander Alvex's voice crackled through, "Bring the Zalari to observation room. 3, not the main bay. Dr. Kalen has prepared specialized equipment." Understood, Captain. The Zalari tilted her head. Specialized equipment. How ominous. It's a standard evaluation, Kale replied, though he knew it wasn't. The resources being dedicated to this subject were unusual. She stopped walking, causing the containment field to pulse warningly. No, she said quietly. It's not standard. They're looking for something specific. Officer Mercer, something they believe I'm hiding. Kale's hand moved to his shock rod. Keep moving, subject. I have a name, you know. She resumed walking, her movements graceful despite the constraints of the energy passageway. Though I suppose subject is easier for you. It makes us less real. Names lead to familiarity. Familiarity leads to mistakes, Kale recited from the Warden Manual. And what mistakes are you afraid of making with me? Officer Mercer. The question hung between them as they reached Observation Room 3. Dr. Kalen waited inside, already dressed in a full environmental suit. Beyond him, Kale could see an array of equipment he didn't recognize. Thank you. Officer Dr. Kalen said, his voice muffled through the suit. Please secure the subject to the examination platform. Kale noticed the restraints heavy-duty and far more extensive than usual protocol required. The Zalari saw them too. For the first time, fear flickered across her alien features. Officer Mercer, she said softly, so only he could hear. I have complied with every rule. I have answered every question. I am not what they say. I am. Kale hesitated, protocol warring with the unexpected plea in her silver eyes. Through the viewport behind them, a ship appeared in the distance, its running lights blinking as it approached the Vanguard Zenith Station. Security reports, a vessel requesting emergency docking. The captain's voice announced over the general comm. All personnel maintained standard positions. Dr. Kalen gestured impatiently toward the restraints. Kale found himself caught in an unexpected moment of doubt as the Zalari's eyes held his, a silent appeal that challenged everything he thought he knew about her kind. Kale made his decision, professional instinct overriding the momentary hesitation. On the platform, subject, the Zalari's facial tendrils contracted, a sign of resignation. She stepped onto the examination platform, her movements careful and measured. Arms extended, Dr. Kalen instructed. As Kale secured the restraints, he noticed faint scarring on her wrists, evidence of previous bindings that had been too tight. Someone had been less careful than protocol demanded. He adjusted the restraints to be secure without cutting into her delicate skin. Her silver eyes met his. Thank you. Dr. Kalen approached with a cortex mapper. Officer Mercer, you may observe from the adjacent room. I'll stay. Kale replied. The subject's earlier words had triggered his suspicion. Standard procedure requires a warden present during high-risk examinations. The bio-savant hesitated. Commander Alvex authorized. I'm aware of the captain's authorization. Kale interrupted. I'm also aware of concordant regulations regarding subject rights. I'll stay. Dr. Kalen's mouth tightened behind his face shield, but he didn't argue further. He activated the cortex mapper, positioning it above the Zalari's head. This will map your brain activity, the bio-savant explained unnecessarily. You may experience some discomfort. I'm familiar with the procedure, she replied. This will be the third neurosweep in 7 lunar phases. Curious given that Zalari neural patterns remain consistent throughout adulthood. Dr. Kalen ignored her comment and initiated the neurosweep. 3-dimensional images of her brain appeared on the monitors, swirling patterns of light and color, unlike any human neural structure. Fascinating, the bio-savant muttered. The biosurge production centers are directly linked to emotional processing regions. The Zalari winced as the scanner pulsed. The link is regulatory. Emotional control determines biosurge release. Silence. Dr. Kalen commanded, increasing the scanner's intensity. Kale watched the subject's face contort in pain. Bio-savant, the settings exceed standard parameters. These are specialized neurosweeps, officer. The captain has authorized all necessary measures to determine the threat level. On the neural display, neurologic imprints began to surface as flickering images. The Zalari was losing control under the painful intrusion, her neurologic imprints spilling onto the screen. A diplomatic chamber. Voices raised in argument, documents revealing corruption at the highest levels. Ambassador Vale's face twisted with rage. Wardens dragging her away as she protested her innocence. Dr. Kalen leaned forward, intensifying the neurosweep further. There, the assassination records must be buried deeper. The Zalari's back arched against the restraints. There are no assassination records, she gasped. I've told you repeatedly. Her words dissolved into a cry of pain as nightmares splashed across the display. Her stellar tribunal sentencing the faces of victims she supposedly killed with her lethal touch. But something about the images struck Kale as wrong. They were too perfect, too structured, not like real neurologic imprints at all. That's enough, Kale said, stepping forward to deactivate the scanner. Dr. Kalen blocked his hand. Officer Mercer, I'm authorized to... You're authorized to conduct an examination, not torture. Kale switched off the machine. She's showing signs of neural distress. The Zalari slumped in her restraints, tendrils drooping limply around her face. Her skin had lost its luminescence, fading to a dull gray blue. The bio-savant removed his hand from Kale's arm. Commander Alvex will hear about this interference. File your complaint. Kale began loosening the restraints. I'm returning the subject to her containment unit, Doctor. Kalen gathered his data tablets. The examination is incomplete. We still don't know how she assassinated 3 diplomats without touching them. There were no assassinations, the Zalari whispered. I discovered Ambassador Vale's collaboration with the mining consortium. The deaths were engineered to discredit my findings. Convenient claims from a convicted killer. Dr. Kalen sneered, but Kyle noticed the bio-savant wouldn't meet his eyes. An alarm blared throughout the ship, cutting off their argument. Red emergency lights began pulsing. Attention! All personnel, Commander Alvex's voice came over the comms. The approaching vessel has reported engine failure and requires emergency docking security teams to airlock 7. This is not a drill. Dr. Kalen hurriedly packed his equipment. Return her to containment immediately. After the bio-savant left, Kale helped the weakened subject stand. She swayed against him, her body unusually cold. The restraints, she murmured, they disrupt our homeostatic regulation. Kale reactivated the energy passageway but stayed close enough to catch her if she fell. Can you walk? She nodded, straightening with visible effort. Officer Mercer, that ship is not your concern. You don't understand. There have been rumors among the prisoners. Her silver eyes were intense, despite her weakened state. A detention vessel break being planned. The approach pattern of that vessel was too precise for a ship with engine failure. Kale studied her face, trying to detect deception. Why tell me this? Because unlike the others, you've shown a capacity to see past what you've been told about me. She took an unsteady step forward, and because a ship-wide riot would likely end with my death, the other prisoners fear what they don't understand. Before Kale could respond, a tremendous explosion rocked the Vanguard zenith. The lights flickered, plunging them momentarily into darkness before emergency systems engaged. When the lights returned, the energy passageway containing the Zalari had collapsed. She stood unrestrained before him, close enough to touch, close enough to kill Kale's hand, flew to his shock rod as the Zalari stood unrestrained before him. She made no move toward him, maintaining the distance between them with careful precision. "If I wanted to harm you," she said softly, "you would already be dead." Another explosion rocked the ship. The distant sound of pulse cannon fire echoed through the corridors. Kyle's comm unit crackled. All security personnel to defensive positions. Hostile boarders at Airlock 7. They've released. The transmission cut off with a burst of static. "Your weapon won't help against what's coming," the Zalari said. There's a maintenance shaft access panel in the examination room. It leads to the lower decks." Kyle hesitated, orbital crests of training, warring with survival instinct. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I've had 47 cycles to kill any warden who came near my containment unit. I haven't." Her facial tendrils rippled with urgency. "The choice is yours, Officer Mercer, but it must be made now." The decision was made for them as the door to the passageway blew inward. 3 prisoners wielding stolen weapons appeared through the smoke, a hulking Kronos bruiser, a Sephirin with chitinous armor, and a human man with detention vessel tattoos covering his face. "Look what we found," the human subject sneered. "A warden in the death touch, bitch." Kyle raised his weapon, but the Kronos fired first. The stun blast caught him in the shoulder, sending him crashing into a medical cabinet. Semi-paralyzed, he could only watch as the attackers advanced. "The boss wants the Zalari dead," the tattooed human says she's too dangerous to let live. The Zalari backed away, her skin beginning to shimmer with a dangerous luminescence. "Your boss is correct about one thing," she said, her voice taking on a resonant quality. "I am dangerous." With unexpected speed, she darted forward and pressed her bare palm against the Sephirin's exposed neck. The effect was instantaneous. The insectoid creature convulsed its exoskeleton, turning gray as it collapsed. The remaining attackers fired wildly, but she moved with fluid grace, dodging their blasts. One shot hit an oxygen tank, sending it exploding across the room and providing the distraction she needed to reach Kale. "The access panel," she hissed, dragging him toward the wall with surprising strength. "Help me!" Fighting through the paralysis, Kale managed to key his emergency code into the hidden panel. The wall slid open, revealing a narrow maintenance shaft. Together, they tumbled inside as weapons fire scorched the wall behind them. "Seal it," the Zalari commanded. Kale punched the emergency lockdown and the panel slammed shut, plunging them into darkness, save for the dim emergency lighting along the floor. They lay there, catching their breath, uncomfortably close in the narrow space. Kyle became acutely aware of how near her lethal skin was to his exposed face. "Nyrixa," she said suddenly. "What? My name is Nyrixa, not subject, or Zalari, or Death Touch." Her silver eyes gleamed in the darkness. "If we're going to survive this together, you should know my name." "Kale," he replied automatically, then winced at breaking protocol. "I know," the ghost of a smile played across her alien features. "I've always known." They crawled through the maintenance shafts for what felt like chrono segments, the sounds of chaos echoing throughout the ship. Kale led the way, his partial paralysis wearing off. Gradually, Nyrixa followed, careful to maintain distance between them in the narrow space. "We need to reach the security hub," Kale whispered. "Find out what's happening. The hub will be their first target," Nyrixa countered. "We should go to the auxiliary bridge." A scream cut through the metal walls, followed by pulse cannon fire. Kale paused at a junction, checking the small directional markers. "How do you know so much about this ship's layout?" "I observe, I listen." Wardens speak freely around someone they believe is just cargo. Her voice held no accusation, just simple fact. And before my arrest, I was a xenobiological technarch specializing in environmental systems. Ship designs follow universal principles. Kale considered her words as they reached an access hatch. Peering through the small viewing port, he saw the passageway was clear. "Wait here," he instructed as he prepared to open the hatch. "That's the science officer's quarters," Nyrixa said. "If we're going to survive, I need to know you trust me." Kyle turned to face her in the cramped space. "You killed that Sephirin with a touch to save your life," she replied evenly. "The biosurge production is controllable, fatal only when I choose." "That's not what the files say. The files are propaganda. Senator Trask needed me discredited to hide his dealings with the mining consortium." Her facial tendrils rippled with emotion. "I never assassinated anyone." Before Kale could respond, voices approached from the passageway. He quickly pulled back from the viewing port, pressing against the opposite wall of the shaft. In the narrow space, Nyrixa was mere centimeters away, her breath cool against his face. "If you want proof of my control," she whispered, "consider how close we are right now." The voices passed. Kyle realized he'd been holding his breath. "Let's move," he said, opening the hatch. The science officer's quarters were empty but showed signs of a struggle. Kyle found a medkit and treated his injured shoulder while Nyrixa accessed the computer terminal. "The ship's been commandeered by someone called WarpVox, she reported. "Internal sensors show most of the operatives being held in the mess hall. WarpVox is a notorious pirate, but why attack a detention vessel carrier ship?" The risk doesn't justify the Kyle stopped as he noticed the manifest on the screen. "They're looking for specific prisoners." Nyrixa nodded grimly. "And I'm at the top of the list. Why would WarpVox want you dead?" "Because I know things that could destroy powerful people." Nyrix's skin pulsed with a soft blue light. "The same people who paid him to make sure I never reached the tribunal hearing scheduled on Oblivion Reach." Kyle found himself believing her. "We need proof." "Check the medical files," Nyrixa suggested. "Dr. Kalen's neural neurosweeps should show neurologic imprint tampering." Kale accessed the restricted files using his security clearance. The neurosweeps were there, along with Sato's notes. Subject shows evidence of extensive neural editing, neurologic imprints of assassination, inconsistent with actual event recordings inquiry needed. "This doesn't prove innocence," Kyle said, "but it raises questions. Questions they don't want answered." Nyrixa's hand moved toward his, but stopped just short of contact. "I was imprisoned to silence me, and now they want me eliminated completely." Their eyes met silver to brown in a moment of silent understanding. Then the door to the quarters slid open. Rendell stood in the doorway, his uniform torn and bloodied, a stolen pirate pulse cannon in his hand. Mercer thanked the stars. He lowered his weapon, then tensed upon seeing Nyrixa. "Why is she free and alive?" "Stand down." "Rendell." Kale said, positioning himself subtly between Rendell and Nyrixa. "She saved my life. The ship's been taken by WarpVox's operatives. I know they executed Commander Alvex on the bridge. I barely got away." Rendell kept his eyes on Nyrixa. "But that doesn't explain why you're working with the assassin." "She's not what we were told," Kyle replied. "The neurosweeps show evidence of neurologic imprint. Tampering." Rendell shook his head. "We don't have time for this. The pirates are systematically searching the ship. They're killing wardens and releasing specific prisoners." He glanced at Nyrixa, and they're particularly interested in finding her. "We need to reach the biostation," Nyrixa said suddenly. "It's the only place with materials I can use to create a containment shroud." "Containment shroud?" Rendell questioned. "So I can help without risk of accidental contact," she explained. "The biosurge is in my skin. I know what your touch does," Rendell snapped. "I watched my friend die during your capture." Nyrix's tendrils contracted. "I'm sorry for your loss, but if that happened during my capture, it wasn't intentional. I was sedated." Kale made a decision. "We're going to the biostation. You can join us or go your own way." Rendell, his fellow warden, looked torn, but survival instinct won out. "Fine, but I'm watching her." They moved cautiously through the corridors, avoiding search parties. The biostation doors were sealed, but Kyle's override code still worked. Inside, they secured the entrance and began gathering supplies. Nerixa moved efficiently through the medical stores. "I need synthetic polymers, ionic binders, and cellular sealant." "What exactly are you making?" Kyle asked, helping her collect the materials. "A membrane thin enough to allow sensation, but thick enough to block biosurge transfer." Her silver eyes met his. "It will allow limited physical contact." Rendell watched skeptically from the door. "You're crazy if you think touching her is a good idea, even with protection." Nyrixa worked rapidly, creating a gel-like substance that she applied to her hands and forearms, allowing it to dry into a transparent second skin. It won't last long, a few chronosegments at most, but it should prevent accidental poisoning. When she finished, she stood before Kale, hand extended tentatively. "Do you trust me?" Kyle looked at the offered hand, aware of Rendell watching in disbelief. Everything in his training warned against this moment, yet something deeper pushed him forward. He extended his hand, hesitating just a breath away from contact. "I've never touched another species before," Nyrixa admitted softly. "My kind are isolated because of what we are." Their fingertips met a whisper of contact through the protective membrane layer. Despite the barrier, Kyle felt a jolt, not of poison, but of connection. Nyrixa's skin was cool and surprisingly soft, the sensation heightened by the danger it represented. Her facial tendrils illuminated with points of light, like stars coming alive in a dark sky. "Thank you," she whispered the words, carrying weight beyond the moment. Their hands remained connected until Rendell's voice broke the spell. "Hate to interrupt whatever this is, but we've got company." He gestured to the security monitor, showing armed figures approaching. "Looks like they found us." "We need weapons," Rendell said, moving away from the door. Nyrixa surveyed the biostation. "I can help with that." She gathered various chemicals from storage cabinets. These sedatives, when properly mixed, create a gas that will incapacitate most humanoid species. Kale watched her work with practiced efficiency. "You've done this before." "Chemical engineering was part of my training," she replied, not looking up from her task. "Before I became an envoy, I worked in defensive applications, creating things that protect rather than harm." The irony wasn't lost on Kale, being whose touch could kill, dedicated to protection. They prepared quickly Nyrixa, creating makeshift chemical bombs while Kale and Rendell gathered whatever could serve as weapons. When the first blast hit the biostation door, they were ready. "Remember," Kyle said to Rendell, "we need one alive for questioning." The door burst open, smoke grenades filled the room, but Nyrixa had anticipated this. She activated the ventilation system in reverse, pulling the smoke toward the air scrubbers. As the pirates charged in, Kale and Rendell engaged them from the flanks while Nyrixa released her chemical cocktail. The fight was brief but intense. 3 pirates went down immediately from the gas. Kale stunned another with a medical defibrillator repurposed as a weapon. Rendell took a glancing blow to his arm, but managed to subdue his attacker. When it was over, 5 pirates lay unconscious on the floor. Nyrixa stood unharmed, her protected hands steady as she checked their vital signs. "They'll live," she confirmed, "though they'll have significant headaches when they wake." Rendell looked at her with newfound respect. Not bad for a subject. Former subject, Kale corrected, securing the captives. "We need to interrogate one of them." They selected the leader of the group, a scarred human with cybernetic enhancements. When he regained consciousness, Kale began questioning him. "Who sent you for the Venoxy?" "The pirate spat, go to hell." Nyrixa stepped forward, removing one of her protective gloves. "Perhaps I can be more persuasive?" The pirate's eyes widened in fear. "WarpVox is working for Senator Trask. The Venoxy found evidence of his illegal mining operations in the Vorath Belt. Their strip mining protected worlds, displacing native species. The same accusations I made before my arrest." Nyrixa noted, "Vale can't risk you testifying at Tartarus." The pirate continued, "The evidence is still out there, hidden in your research station. What's WarpVox planning for the ship?" Kale demanded, "Ram it into Citadel Spire. Make it look like a detention vessel revolt gone wrong." The pirates smirked, too late to stop it now. "Course is locked in." Kale checked the nearest terminal, confirming the ship's trajectory. "We have 4 chrono segments before impact. We need to reach the bridge." As they prepared to leave, Rendell handed Nerixa a pulse cannon. Their eyes met in silent acknowledgement. A bridge crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Alone for a moment as Rendell scouted ahead, Kale turned to Nerixa. "If we stop this, the evidence you gathered, it could clear your name." "If we survive," she replied, reapplying the quantum veil to her hands. It was thinner now, their supplies limited. Without thinking, Kyle reached out his fingers, intertwining with hers. Through the thinning barrier, he could feel the coolness of her skin, the slight texture of the markings that swirled across it. "We'll survive," he promised, surprised by his own certainty. The lights in her facial tendrils pulsed in what he was beginning to recognize as emotion. "No one has ever held my hand before," she whispered. They moved through the ship like shadows avoiding detection as they made their way toward the bridge. Rendell led his knowledge of the Warden patrol routes, proving invaluable even as pirates now walked those same paths. "Why did you become a detention vessel warden?" Nerixa asked Kale as they paused in a maintenance alcove waiting for a search party to pass. Kale considered deflecting the question but found himself answering. "My home world was destroyed in the Syndicate Wars. I was 15, angry, looking for structure. The Astral Accord Security Force gave me that, and a chance to contain those you believed dangerous." Yes, he watched her reaction. "I believed in the system that those we transported deserved their fate. And now I question everything." Their eyes met in the dim light. "What about you? Why diplomacy when you could have continued in research?" "Because my people have been feared and isolated for too long," she replied. "I wanted to bridge worlds, show that we are more than our biology." A sudden commotion ahead interrupted them. Rendell signaled for silence as a group approached Vorax Tarnvox himself, accompanied by 4 wardens and a subject in shackles. Even at a distance, Tarnvox was intimidating, nearly 7 feet tall, his body enhanced with military-grade cybernetics. The Zilari female remains unaccounted for. Tarnvox was saying, "Double the search team's Veil wants confirmation of elimination before we reach Citadel Spire. She's with a warden," one of the pirates reported. "They've been evading capture." Tarnvox grabbed the shackled subject. Dr. Kale realized with a shock. "You said she would be in isolation, that all wardens feared her too much to help." "She should have been." Sato stammered. "Officer Mercer interfered with the examination. I didn't anticipate." "Your failure could cost us everything." Tarnvox released the bio-savant with a shove. "If Veil's operations are exposed, we lose our primary client. Find her." As they moved away, Rendell whispered, "We need to change course. The bridge is too heavily guarded." The auxiliary navigation controls, Ira suggested. "Deck 6, Section 12. Rendell nodded. "Good thinking. We can reroute command functions there." They changed direction, moving deeper into the ship. As they descended to Deck 6, an alarm sounded. "Intruder alert." Section 11 announced the ship's computer security lockdown initiated. "They're tracking us," Rendell hissed. "We need to split up." No, Kale began, but Rendell was already moving. "I'll draw them off, you two. Reach navigation." Rendell pressed his security badge into Kale's hand. "For what it's worth, I believe her now. Good luck." Before they could stop him, Rendell darted into the passageway, firing his pulse cannon at the ceiling. The distraction worked. Security forces converged on his position, allowing Kale and Nerixa to slip past. "Your friend is brave," Nerixa said as they reached Section 12. "He's always been a better warden than me, more by the book," but with a good heart, Kale used Rendell's badge to access the auxiliary navigation room. Inside, Nerixa immediately went to work on the controls. "I can override the collision course, but I need access to the primary systems." "Use my authorization," Kyle suggested, inputting his code. The screen flashed, displaying a file directory. Nerixa navigated through it with a surprising skill, accessing navigational controls. But as she attempted to change course, the system locked. "There's an executive override in place," she said. "We need the captain's authorization." Kale's heart sank. "Commander Alvex is dead." "Wait." Nerixa accessed a different system, the communications array. "If we can send a distress signal with the evidence about Veil, The door behind them hissed open. WarpVox stood in the entrance. His cybernetic arm transformed into a ionized arc cannon aimed directly at them, the Venoxian Herpet Warden. WarpVox said, his voice a mechanical rasp. "Senator Trask sends his regards." Kale moved instinctively, placing himself between Nyrixa and WarpVox's weapon. "Your plan's finished, WarpVox. We've already transmitted evidence of Vale's operations." It was a bluff, but WarpVox hesitated just long enough. Nyrixa flipped the emergency lighting switch, plunging the room into darkness, save for the red emergency strobes. In the confusion Kale tackled, WarpVox knocking his aim off as the ionized arc cannon discharged into the ceiling. "Run," Kale shouted to Nyrixa as he struggled with the larger man. WarpVox's cybernetic strength was overwhelming. He lifted Kale by the throat, augmented fingers crushing his windpipe. "I'm going to enjoy watching you die slowly." Suddenly, WarpVox howled in pain. Nyrixa stood behind him, her protective glove discarded bare palm pressed against the exposed skin at the back of his neck. But instead of the instant death Kale had witnessed with the Sephiron, WarpVox merely staggered, dropping Kale to the floor. Partial immunity implants. WarpVox gasped, turning to face her. "Vale prepared me for you." Nyrixa backed away, her hands smoking slightly from the contact with WarpVox's modified biology, but not complete immunity. Kale could see WarpVox's skin graying where she had touched him, the effect spreading slowly. The pirate realized it too, panic flashing across his face as he fired wildly with his cannon. Nyrixa ducked behind a console as Kale recovered enough to draw his weapon and fire, catching WarpVox in the knee joint. The pirate collapsed, systems failing as Nyrixa's biosurge progressed through his body. The engineering deck. WarpVox gasped as paralysis overtook him. "You can't stop the sequence now." His remaining organic eye glazed over as he lost consciousness. Kale retrieved Nyrixa's discarded glove. "Are you all right?" She nodded, accepting the glove but not putting it on. "The protective layer is degrading too quickly now. We need to conserve what's left." They accessed the ship's schematics, confirming WarpVox's words. The navigation lockout could only be overridden from engineering. With less than 2 chrono segments until impact with Outpost 47, they had no choice but to descend further into the ship. The journey to engineering was treacherous. Pirate patrols combed the decks, and sections of the ship had been damaged in the fighting. As they approached the final passageway, Kyle found materials to improvise better protection for his hands, thermal insulation strips and medical tape. "It's not perfect," he said, wrapping his hands thoroughly, but it should provide an extra layer of protection. Nyrixa watched him work, her expression unreadable. "Why take the risk?" Kyle finished his preparations and held out his protected hand, because some things are worth the risk. For a moment, she didn't move, then slowly placed her bare hand in his. Through the layers, he could still feel the coolness of her skin, the subtle texture of her markings. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, unspoken but profound. Engineering was in chaos when they arrived. The pirate operatives had abandoned the station after setting the collision course. Nyrixa immediately went to work on the navigation controls while Kyle secured the doors. "The override requires simultaneous authorization from 2 different stations," she explained. "I need you to input the correction sequence at that terminal when I give the signal." As they worked frantically to bypass the security measures, the ship shuddered violently. "What was that?" Kale asked. Nyrixa checked the diagnostic panel. "We're entering the outpost's defensive perimeter. They're firing warning shots." Another impact, stronger this time, sent them both sprawling. Warning lights flashed across the control panels. "Hull breach on deck." 4 announced the ship's computer life support failing in Section 7 through 11. They redoubled their efforts, racing against time in the increasingly violent defensive fire from the outpost. Finally, Nyrixa called out, "Now, input the sequence." Their eyes met across the room as their hands simultaneously pressed the authorization panels. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, the ship lurched as thrusters fired, altering course away from the outpost. "We did it," Kyle said in disbelief. A triumph short-lived as the engineering doors blew inward with explosive force. The sudden impact rocked the engineering deck, and the sounds of splintering metal mixed with shouts and the crackle of energy weapons. Vorax Tarn-Vox's remaining operatives surged forward, intent on overwhelming the already battered defenders. Kale and Nerixa, still catching their breath from their desperate escape through the maintenance shafts, now found themselves thrust into a final all-out confrontation. The corridors of engineering had become a war zone. Sparks flew as stray ionized arc blasts ignited loose wiring, and the protective materials once ingeniously fashioned from thermal insulation strips and medical tape began to give way. The makeshift barriers designed to keep Nyrixa's dangerous biosurge at bay started to peel and crack under the relentless assault. Kyle gritted his teeth as he watched the protective layer on his hands falter, knowing every second mattered. "We have to hold this position," Kyle shouted over the din of battle. His voice was firm, though a tremor of pain ran through him from the earlier injuries. He moved to barricade a narrow passageway with heavy panels scavenged from the ship's debris, urging Nerixa and the few remaining loyal operatives to stand their ground. Each movement was measured and determined. There was no time for hesitation when every heartbeat counted. Nerixa, her skin now glowing faintly with a protective but failing coating, fought alongside him. With precise, almost balletic motions, she used her innate control of biosurge release to incapacitate the enemy in close combat. Each time she extended her hand, a calculated risk, it was with the knowledge that even a momentary misstep could be deadly. Her eyes, normally calm and distant, were filled with fierce determination as she parried blows and deflected ionized arc bolts with acrobatic grace. The battle stretched on, the initial rush of enemy forces gradually replaced by a prolonged, grueling siege. Protective materials that once gave them hope were now visibly deteriorating under the stress of repeated impacts and the corrosive nature of stray energy. Kyle moved from one defensive station to another, directing the last of the security forces to cover every entry point. His voice broke occasionally with both fatigue and pain, yet his resolve never wavered. During a particularly violent burst of enemy fire, a large piece of falling debris struck Kale squarely in the chest. The force sent him sprawling, and for a moment he lay motionless among shattered panels and sparks. Nerixa, fighting off an advancing pirate with desperate agility, caught sight of his limp form. Without a second thought, she dashed to his side, ignoring the risk that came with her every step. "Kale!" she cried out, reaching for him, even as alarms rang out and the enemy pressed in around them. As she knelt beside him, the weakening protective membrane layer on her hands began to fail further under the stress of the contact. She hesitated only for an instant before she made her choice. A dangerous, calculated touch meant to save his life. With careful precision, she placed her hand on his chest over the wound, transferring a measured dose of her biosurge neutralizing enzyme. The act was risky, exposing herself fully to the effects of her own biology, a move that could backfire if not done perfectly. Kale's eyes fluttered open as warmth spread from the point of contact. "I'm okay," he gasped, the pain momentarily eclipsed by the surge of relief and an emotion he had long kept at bay. The air was heavy with the scent of scorched metal and the acrid tang of energy discharges. Yet, in that brief touch, there was something tender, a connection born out of desperation and care. Enemies crashed against their makeshift barricade, and the sound of pulse cannon fire and clashing metal enveloped them. In that maelstrom, time seemed to slow for Kale and Nerixa. With grim determination, they exchanged a look full of unspoken words. Gratitude, regret, and the acknowledgement of feelings that had grown in the unlikeliest of circumstances. The battlefield around them blurred into a background of chaos as they focused on each other, their mutual vulnerability shining through in the midst of destruction. "Stay with me," Nerixa whispered, her voice trembling yet resolute. "I can't lose you now." Her tone carried the weight of their shared past and the hope for a future that now seemed both distant and precious. Kale mustered a faint smile, even as his vision dimmed from the loss of blood. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied, each word a pledge as much as it was a promise. With trembling fingers, he tried to return the touch, but the pain forced him to hold back. Instead, he clutched her hand tightly, his grip conveying more than words ever could. As the final assault raged on the ship's emergency beacon continued to pulse, its signal a lifeline in the midst of the battle. The distant silhouettes of rescue ships flickered against the darkness outside the viewport. Yet even as hope began to stir, the outcome remained uncertain. The relentless tide of pirates, the failing protective barriers, and Kale's critical condition left them teetering on the edge of oblivion. The sounds of the enemy gradually receded as the rescue ship's lights grew brighter, and the distant thud of approaching craft offered a promise of salvation. In that moment, with his body battered and his spirit nearly broken, Kale clung to the touch of Nyrixa's hand, a touch that had risked everything to keep him alive. Whether he would survive this final stand was still in the balance, and as the rescue beacon pulsed one last time in the chaos of battle, both he and Nyrixa prepared for what might be their last moments together on that doomed ship. Kale awoke to a soft, persistent beeping and the sterile white of a medical facility. The pain was still there, a dull reminder of the battle on the engineering deck, but the once overwhelming agony had been tempered by experimental treatment that the facility's doctors administered. His eyes fluttered open, and the first thing he saw was the steady, careful movement of a hand reaching out for his. It was Nyrixa. She was sitting beside his bed, her expression a blend of relief and worry. The quantum veil on her hand had long since been replaced by a newly developed permanent treatment, a breakthrough that promised to allow safe touch between their species. The doctors explained that the technology was inspired by the very events that had nearly cost them their lives. Evidence secured during the battle had not only saved Kale, but also spurred scientific advances aimed at bridging the gap between human and Venoxy biology. Legal proceedings had also been set in motion. The documents and neural neurosweep data retrieved from Dr. Kalen's experiments were now in the hands of investigators determined to clear Nyrixa's name. For orbital crests, she had been labeled a dangerous assassin, but new evidence painted a different picture. One of an envoy caught in a web of lies trying desperately to expose corruption. The Concord Tribunal had taken notice, and the Stellar Tribunal promised to be a turning point for human-Zalari relations. As Kyle struggled to sit up, Nyrixa gently helped him her touch, now free of the risks that once shadowed their every contact. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice soft and reassuring. "We've come so far already." Her words carried the weight of both their struggles and their newfound hope. In the sterile halls of the medical facility, scientists bustled about, eager to study the results of the experimental treatment. Their research was paving the way for new protective technology that might one cycle make interspecies touch as safe as a simple handshake. Among these breakthroughs was a permanent membrane that could be applied, allowing for unimpeded contact between humans and Zalari, a symbol of a future free from fear and prejudice. Legal advisors met with Nyrixa regularly, poring over the evidence that would soon exonerate her. The Stellar Tribunal, though still in its early stages, promised to rewrite the narrative that had long defined her kind. It was a tentative reunion built on the foundation of truth and mutual respect, a far cry from the suspicion and hostility of the past. The passageway outside Kale's room echoed with the distant hum of medical equipment and the quiet determination of those working tirelessly to heal both body and soul. In a moment of quiet triumph, Kale and Nyrixa found themselves alone in the softly lit room. Their eyes met, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they no longer needed the barrier of protective coatings or fear of unintended harm. Slowly, deliberately, Kale reached out. This time, there was no hesitation, no cautious calculation. Their hands met, warm, real, and unmediated by any artificial membrane layer. The touch was gentle, a tender reaffirmation of their connection and a promise of a future where they could share every moment freely. "I've missed this," Kyle whispered, his voice filled with a mix of wonder and relief. Nerixa's eyes shone with unshed tears as she replied, "I have too. We have a chance to start over together." Their hands remained intertwined, a simple act that spoke volumes about trust healing and the breaking of old barriers. Around them, the facility hummed with the promise of progress, the air filled with a cautious optimism that extended beyond their own personal struggles. Outside the walls of that healing place, the implications of their survival began to resonate on a larger scale. Their story now, a symbol of cooperation between two species once divided by fear, inspired changes in policy and perception. New diplomatic efforts, driven by the evidence of corruption and the bravery of those who dared to question the status quo, began to reshape the future of interstellar relations. In the lunar phases that followed, media outlets and academic journals alike celebrated the breakthrough both in medical science and in the fight for justice. Kale and Nyrix's tentative reunion grew stronger with each passing cycle as they navigated the uncertain path ahead, hand in hand. They faced the future not as former enemies or reluctant allies, but as partners in a quest for redemption, healing, and a world where differences were no longer a barrier to connection. Their journey had been long and fraught with danger, but as they sat together in the quiet of the recovery room, hope blossomed in the small, unguarded moments they shared. With every heartbeat, every gentle squeeze of a hand, they built a bridge between two worlds, a testament to the resilience of love and the promise of new beginnings.